Mr. Swaminathan Aiyar, consulting editor with ET Now, and N.K. Singh, member of Parliament, represents JDU. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Swami, does it seem evident that the UPA allies are keen to go for early polls, because what could favor regional parties currently is this entire anti-incumbency wave?
Okay, there is the word early raises the question, how early? I think there's an excellent chance that there may be no election in 2012. There may indeed be an election in 2013, if not in 2014. So the question is something, a target like mid-2013. At that point, I think the government would become very unstable. Lots of people would say, why give the government 1 year more? We might as well go for a midterm election now. So I think Pranab Mukherjee would be unwise to think that he can present a full budget in 2013. Perhaps he can, perhaps he can't. But as a precaution, if I was him, I would say, if 2012 is a really tough budget, I have to consider whether this is an appropriate one, whether it's if it's going to be the last budget of the UPA government. For that reason, I feel that it's going to be less tough than he originally envisaged. He is going to keep in mind the possibility of an early election. I don't think you can put it more strongly than that. The fact is, just today, the BSP seems to have tied up with the Congress to form a government in Uttarakhand. If the BSP is going to be with Congress, that gives them considerable comfort in New Delhi. Because if the BSP is with Congress, that offsets the ability of Mamta and the SP combined to topple the government. So I would say that today's events have really given a fresh sense of relief to the Congress party, to Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. On this basis, I think he can go ahead hoping that he will have one more full budget.
Right. Mr. Singh, I just want to get you in on this as well. How much probability would you assign to a possibility of a midterm polls, as increasingly markets are discussing about it?
I think these are very hypothetical questions, because right now the prerogative of whether or not to call the midterm polls entirely rests with the government in office. And it is they who will come to a conclusion one way or the other if the numbers do not add up. But I do not think that whatever be the probabilities one way or the other, the government should be really thinking of postponing important economic decisions which are necessary for restoring the health of the economy and for the Indian economy to go forward.
Swami, if we get early polls, do you think that will be a big setback for the Congress?
Look, I think if there's one thing history has shown, it is that election budgets do not win elections. I would put this as a general rule. I mean, I have watched election after election after election. In the vast majority of them, the incumbent loses, even though there's an election budget. The last time, 2009, was one rare occasion when the incumbent won. But before that, you have to go back to the 1970s to find an incumbent who got re-elected. So the fact is that an election budget by itself does not win elections. If so, it makes sense to say, why don't I just go ahead and do the appropriate reforms without doing something which is so glaringly unpopulist, like, shall we say, sharply increasing the price of fertilizers. So that is the kind of budget I would hope from Pranab Mukherjee. Something which keeps in mind the fact that, there is some scope for doing some sensible things, and at the same time, we need to avoid something that can bring a rain of opposition anger and can prevent farmers from coming out onto the streets.
Swami, the market is, beginning to speculate about the possibility of a fourth front emerging as well. Do you believe there are realistic chances of regional parties stitching together a formidable coalition, and when do you see that happening?
The numbers are not favorable to them. What would you stitch together some such front? What for? If you do it in order to fight the next election together, yes, you can think about it. But look, credibly, can you really see Trinamool and the left front coming together in an election? I can't. And if we just have Trinamool and SP and some other people, how much does that amount to? After the alliance that we've just seen of BSP and Congress in Uttarakhand, I would say definitely we are now seeing a new political formation. Mayawati in UP is going to be much more inclined to line up with Congress than line up with the BJP as she has in the past. In these circumstances, I think the third front would have to ask itself, what are we getting together and for what purpose? And if that purpose is not very clear, I don't think it will go beyond the level of just chatting about it. On the other hand, if there is an election in 2013 or 2014, which results in a very, very hung parliament, at that point, you can get a third front coming together as a minority government, as happened between 1996 and 1998. So I think that might be more important after an election, in case both Congress and BJP fall very well short of a majority. Only in those circumstances will the third front really then become something that works.
Mr. Singh, this question is coming your way. There are several state elections which are now due in next 6 to 12 months. How do you see Congress dealing with that, or is it too early to take a call on that?
You know, India is unfortunately a country where we have elections in the states almost every year. Not every state election can be taken to be a validation or otherwise of the mandate of the central government. Economic policies cannot become hostage to state elections. The government in office has an obligation and indeed a responsibility to act what is good for the country with unmindful of the consequences of state elections. Every year, economic policies cannot undergo this uncertainty of the electoral cycle of elections, either which have just taken place or which are likely to happen.
Swami, but whether in 2013 or 2014, the fact is that a minority government means political instability, and that's not something that markets like. Given the experience of the mid-90s, would you agree that such a government will struggle to compete or rather complete its term?
Well, you can argue that one out. Mr. Chidambaram will be indignant at what you're saying. He will claim that he presented his great dream budget in 1997-98 when the United Front was in fact the government. So, I mean, there is nothing in the data which shows that the United Front government was a disaster. More correctly, the Asian financial crisis struck in 1997 and ruined the second year of the United Front's rule. But the first year actually it went off quite well. I would simply say that, any United Front formation that we get in New Delhi after the next election would tend to be a short-lived one. As we saw between 1996 and 1998, we had a situation where Deva Gowda lasted less than 12 months, Inder Gujral lasted less than 12 months. So it would be inherently unstable. Both the other parties would be waiting to pull the rug at an appropriate time. So yes, we can get a repeat of that particular situation, and yes, it may be politically unstable, and yet if you go back to 1996, it may not be ruinous for the economy. The plain fact is that, you haven't seen that much action even from this UPA government. And the question has to be asked, how much worse would a United Front government be?
What about policy making? Because, that has been a roadblock that most financial institutional investors as well have been watching out for, policy paralysis. Do you think it will be tough for a coalition of strong regional parties to find common ground, as far as reforms are concerned?
No, that may be the case. But I said, when you look at the UPA, you cannot help but feeling, what reform has this government done? What has it actually done that is purposive? Under this government, you have seen a total disconnect between the so-called budget figures and actual figures. Fertilizer subsidies going through the ceiling with no end in sight. Oil subsidies going through the ceiling with no end in sight. Say various amount of smoke and mirrors, first with some government bonds, and now a plain admission of it. But then what Pranab Mukherjee did in last year's budget? He produced a budget where for the first time nobody believed the data. And he's going to have a similar problem right now. That's it. When you have all these problems, even with what looks like a stable Congress-led government, why assume that a khichdi government of the kind that you may see later would be any worse? I would say that another advantage, in fact, there is a hidden advantage sometimes in a small government. Mr. Chidambaram, I think, was able to push more through as finance minister of the United Front government than he could when he was in the Congress government. So let us see what the composition of the United Front, next United Front government is when it comes about. We have no idea what odd bods might get into that particular combination. Some of them might actually be liberalizers. That is what we did see in 1996, 1998.
So, Swami, who potentially could lead such a coalition? Past experience suggests that it has to be a weak candidate, but this time around we have some strong names to reckon with. Nitish Kumar in Bihar and now Mulayam Singh Yadav in Uttar Pradesh.
If you go back to the experience last time, the conclusion you reach is that the Prime Minister will be a non-entity and not a strong person. When there are so many contenders of importance among the smaller parties, none of them wants to show himself as being number two to somebody else. Therefore, it's better to get a non-entity. So Mr. Deva Gowda became Prime Minister precisely because he did not disturb the balance of power between the parties in New Delhi. So he was pulled out from there. Inder Gujral became Prime Minister for exactly the same reason. So I think once again, if you get a Khichdi third front government, why should Akhilesh Yadav or Nitish Kumar leave their nice, safe fiefdoms at the state government level and come for an entirely uncertain period of a few months in New Delhi when they are likely to be humiliated after a short time? Much better to have a non-entity. A non-entity is by definition somebody that we cannot discover today. It has to be somebody so unlikely that we would not have thought of his name or her name.
Right. Mr. Singh, expectations that good politics will overpower good economics this budget and that the finance minister may announce a populist budget. What would you say to that?
Well, I think in my view that would be a disaster because the macroeconomic fundamentals of the economy are fragile. Our fiscal deficit is tantalizingly close to a double-digit number. Even though we may have the comfort of high reserves, the fact remains that unless important macroeconomic corrections take place, fiscal deficit comes down, subsidies are rationalized, innovative means are found for making direct payment of subsidy to intended beneficiaries. This includes issues like petroleum, oil products, urea, and a whole host of stuff. Unless revenue corrections are made to put back to excise rates on pre-stimulus stuff, and unless investor confidence is restored, markets will remain fragile, macroeconomics will remain uncertain, and I do not think that India will be well served by really creeping forward with a crippled growth rate of just about, it could be even lower than 7% next year, somewhere between 6 to 7%. We need to get back to a high growth trajectory because our poverty compulsions cannot accept something which is lower.
Mr. Singh, markets want a proactive budget with emphasis on subsidy and with a control on fiscal deficit, whereas UP allies, they want a populist budget. How do you think the finance minister will be able to balance it out?
Well, I think it can be, because as I said, that those are the steps, some of the steps on fiscal consolidation are the steps which I have mentioned in the earlier part of my comments. At the same time, I think that we need to certainly take care of those who are disadvantaged, or those who are below the poverty line, by having innovative measures of either cash transfers or special oil vouchers, special fertilizer vouchers, so that the benefits of the subsidy can go to the people who should be the actual beneficiaries of these. At the same time, I think government needs to step up expenditure on health, government needs to step up expenditure on education, and for financing infrastructure, we need to resort to market-based instruments, whereas what I said earlier, taking advantage of historic low rates of interest, which are prevalent in some of the large economies, particularly in the United States and Europe, and I think that the infrastructure financing should be done through this low-cost external borrowing, which will enable really the kind of stimulus and fill up in a time when draft on external capital may be somewhat more difficult and FDI flows look to be somewhat weak.